Time for a new benchmark series. You guys have been hounding me for some CPU, GPU scaling, updated testing for quite a long time now, so I've decided let's go and do that. I've got quite a few comparisons in the works, which will include some fan favorites like the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, as well as Intel's recently discounted Core Ultra 7 265K. So you can expect all of that data shortly. For now though, to get the ball rolling and setting the bar, we have the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, which I'll be comparing with the Ryzen 5 7600X, and this will provide us some interesting insight into where those X3D CPUs offer the biggest gains. And you know what else is interesting?
Today's video is brought to you by Insta360 and their Link 2 and Link 2C 4K webcams. Both models feature a high-performance half-inch sensor delivering crisp 4K video with an AI-powered audio algorithm that provides pretty great sound quality via the built-in microphone. Building on the original Link, the Link 2 series includes AI tracking for individuals and groups, auto framing, and gesture controls, which are pretty neat. Check it out. It also now offers modes such as customizable backgrounds, bokeh, even like a natural blur, so it really adds versatility to every use case. The Link 2, which is the one we're using right now, is equipped with a gimbal, which is perfect for dynamic use cases like teaching or demos, while the Link 2C omits the gimbal, which leans more into the conference call space. With various AI features, both new and improved, on offer here, and a very user-friendly desktop app experience, achieving the perfect presentation for you really couldn't be much simpler. So if you'd like to get your hands on one of these new Insta360 Link 2 series cameras, check out the links in the description for a special Amazon Prime Day offer. Back to you, Steve.
Okay, so the inclusion of the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D is pretty straightforward as it sets the benchmark for everything else. Now the Ryzen 5 7600X, that might seem like a bit more of an odd choice, but for a long time the Ryzen 5 7600 or 7500F were the best value gaming CPUs the AM5 platform had to offer, and the 7600X roughly represents the performance of the 7500F, 7600, 9600 and 9600X. They're all very similar in terms of gaming performance. So for this testing we have 4 games, and I know just 4 that's not a lot, but hear me out. These 4 games have been tested using 2 different quality presets, medium and ultra, at 3 resolutions with 4 different GPUs. That means a single game has 48 data points, each of which is of course based on a 3-run average. Therefore, a huge amount of testing is required for just a single game, and as a result it generates half a dozen graphs to go over. So that being the case, it takes a tremendous amount of time to test just 4 games, and it also takes a long time to go over all the data. Now, outside of the medium and ultra presets, along with the 3 resolutions being 1080p, 1440p and 4K, we also have 4 tiers of GPUs, and they include the GeForce RTX 5090, RTX 5080, RX 9070, and 9060 XT 16GB. Normally I would just stick with NVIDIA GPUs, but with the RX 9070 being quite popular and the 9060 XT 16GB looking like the best value choice right now, I thought it might make sense to include those Radeon GPUs. Plus the RTX 5080 and RX 9070 data might give us some insight into whether or not the driver overhead thing is still an issue, so let's get in the data. First up, we're looking at performance in Rainbow Six Siege, which is a competitive shooter, and we'll be using the medium quality preset, but with the render scale manually set to 100%, and we have the 1080p data here. Using the RTX 5090, we see that the 9800X 3D is 30% faster, and it did deliver a whopping 575 FPS. Of course, the 7600 is still very impressive, allowing for 446 FPS, which will be enough for most gamers. Then using the RTX 5080, the 7600X performance remained much the same. A few extra frames were rendered, but we're talking about a 1% deviation, which is within the margin of error. The real change here can be seen when using the 9800X 3D, as the average frame rate dropped by 4% and the 1% lows by 17%. Now, when switching to the Radeon RX 9070, something unusual happens, though not unexpected, as we have now well documented the NVIDIA overhead issue when using DirectX 12, and this still happens to be a problem even with Blackwell. What we're seeing here is a 10% drop in performance when using the 9800X 3D when compared to what we saw with the RTX 5080. But when using the 7600X, performance is actually 10% higher using the RX 9070, as the reduced overhead of the Radeon GPU helps boost the performance of the Ryzen 5 processor. In fact, this saw the 7600X and RX 9070 combo deliver 12% greater performance when compared to using the RTX 5090. Then once we drop down to the 9060 XT 16GB, the results become heavily GPU limited, and as a result, both CPUs were capped at just under 340 frames per second. Now, moving up to 1440p does change the results quite a bit. Firstly, the RTX 5090 data is less CPU limited, even with the 9800X3D. And as a result, the X3D processor is now 33% faster than the 7600X. Then moving to the RTX 5080 sees performance become almost entirely GPU limited, as both CPUs are able to throughput over 400 FPS. This increase in resolution also knocks the RX 9070 down to 356 FPS, resulting in GPU limited data, just as we saw previously with the 9060 XT. And as a result, the NVIDIA overhead issue cannot be seen anymore, and therefore isn't a problem for these specific hardware configurations using these quality settings. Now at 4K, even with the medium quality settings, the results have become entirely GPU limited. It is worth noting that I am using the built-in benchmark for testing Rainbow Six Siege, and this is because testing in-game is extremely difficult, at least to produce reliable data. And although the built-in benchmark is highly accurate, in the sense that it is very repeatable, it's not as CPU demanding as a lot of the real gameplay, so do keep that in mind. Anyway, using this test, we find the results at 4K to be very much GPU limited, with the RTX 5090 maxing out at 370 FPS. And that being the case, the 9800X3D and 7600X are able to provide the same level of performance. Okay, now we're switching to the Ultra Plus preset, which defaults to a 100% render scale, so we haven't had to adjust that. And once again, we'll be starting with the 1080p data. Even when using these higher quality settings, the 9800X3D is still 27% faster than the 7600X when using the RTX 5090. However, when switching to the RTX 5080, that margin is reduced to just 4%, while we see no difference in performance using the RX 9070 and 9060 XT. Jumping up to 1440p creates a situation where almost all the data is GPU limited. Even when using the RTX 5090, the 9800X3D is a mere 5% faster than the 7600X, or 9% faster when looking at the 1% lows. But when using the RTX 5080, RX 9070, or 9060 XT, the results are all 100% GPU limited, and therefore both CPUs enable the same level of performance. Finally, at 4K with the Ultra Plus settings, the results are now all completely GPU limited, as here the RTX 5090 maxed out at 238 FPS, which is a frame rate that both CPUs can easily throughput. So needless to say, we're also GPU limited with the RTX 5080, RX 9070, and 9060 XT. Moving on to a single player title, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and this is a game that you'd typically play using the highest possible visual settings. Therefore, if you own an RTX 5090, there is virtually no chance you're playing at 1080p, and you certainly wouldn't be doing so with the medium settings. So this test is more for science, and we find under these conditions that the 9800X3D is 37% faster than the 7600X. That margin is reduced to 11% with the RTX 5080, though the 9800X3D did produce 22% higher 1% lows. Then as we move down to the RX 9070 and 9060 XT, the results once again become entirely GPU limited. Naturally, increasing the resolution to 1440p increases the GPU load, but even so with the RTX 5090, the 9800X3D is still 24% faster. Then with the RTX 5080, the average frame rates come together, though the X3D chip is still 17% faster when looking at the 1% lows. Then we have the RX 9070, which drops down to around 150 FPS, and given both CPUs can easily throughput this level of performance, the results become 100% GPU limited, and of course, the same applies to the 9060 XT. Then at 4K, using the medium settings, we've pretty well found the limits of the RTX 5090, even with the 7600X, which was just 2% slower than the 9800X3D for the average frame rate, and 6% slower for the 1% lows. Beyond that, all the testing is 100% GPU limited, and therefore the 7600X and 9800X3D delivered the same level of performance. Now for the ultra quality settings, and again we'll start with the 1080p data. Here the RTX 5090 maxes out at 225 FPS when paired with the 9800X 3D, making that configuration 15% faster than the 7600X. But when we drop down to the RTX 5080, it's only the 1% lows where the 9800X 3D offers any advantage. Here it is 9% faster. Then once we get down to the RX 9070 and 9060 XT, performance is identical using either CPU, because once again the data is heavily GPU limited. Moving up to 1440p places additional load on the GPUs, and now even the RTX 5080 is capping out with the Ryzen 5 processor, and as a result we're looking at the same level of performance using the RTX 5080, RX 9070 and 9060 XT. And that being the case, you won't be shocked to learn that at 4K we are entirely GPU limited, as even the RTX 5090 is good for just over 120 FPS, so let's move on to our next game. And like Rainbow Six Siege, Marvel Rivals is a competitive shooter, so gamers are more likely to prioritize frame rates here over visuals, and therefore the medium quality settings make sense, even for those of you with high-end GPUs, like the RTX 5090. At 1080p, the 9800X 3D was almost 40% faster than the 7600X. That's an insane performance increase. That said, dropping down to the RTX 5080 reduced that margin to just 7%, and then we see no performance difference using the RX 9070 and 9060 XT. Increasing the resolution to 1440p reduced the margin with the RTX 5090 to just 18% in favour of the 9800X 3D, but beyond that we're looking at heavily GPU limited data, and therefore the 9800X 3D and 7600X delivered the same level of performance. Then at 4K, using the medium settings, the 9800X 3D boosted the average frame rate with the RTX 5090 by a mere 5%, though 1% lows were improved by 13%. Still, once we downgrade to the RTX 5080, there is no difference to be seen between these two processors, and therefore the same also applies to the Radeon GPUs. Now, increasing the visual quality with the Ultra preset also increases GPU load, and now at 1080p, we find that the 9800X 3D is just 21% faster than the 7600X, or 26% faster when looking at the 1% lows. Outside of the RTX 5090 though, we see no change in performance, as once again the results end up heavily GPU limited. Then at 1440p, the GPU bottleneck tightens the results up further. Here we're only seeing a performance advantage for the 9800X 3D when using the RTX 5090, just a 5% increase in this example. But beyond that, the results are all GPU limited, and therefore we see no difference between the 9800X 3D and 7600X. Finally, we have Marvel Rivals 4K Ultra data, and as you might have expected, we're very much GPU limited here, just 90 FPS from the RTX 5090, 59 FPS for the RTX 5080, 44 FPS for the RX 9070, and then 27 FPS for the 9060 XT. Finally, we have Space Marine 2, and this game is extremely CPU demanding, and as a consequence, these results are very different to what we've seen so far. This is both a single and multiplayer title, and while I wouldn't say it's a highly competitive game in the sense that it requires super high frame rates, high refresh rate performance is obviously still ideal, especially if you've spent a lot of money on a high-end system. And for that, you will require a very fast CPU, such as the 9800X 3D, which was 41% faster than the 7600X. The Ryzen 5 processor was only able to drive just over 90 FPS in our Horde battle test, which is an acceptable frame rate, but the 9800X 3D, that could go as high as 130 FPS for a truly high refresh rate experience. Now, because this data is, for the most part, CPU limited, we saw the exact same results using the RTX 5080 as we did the 5090, and in fact, it was a similar story even with the RX 9070. Performance only starts to drop away with the 9060 XT, but even here the 9800X 3D was still 22% faster, so a solid performance increase. And even at 1440p, we find that the 9800X 3D is a little over 40% faster than the 7600 when paired with the RTX 5090 or 5080. That margin is reduced to 31% with the RX 9070, which is obviously still a very significant margin, though this time the performance equalizes using the 9060 XT. And even at 4K, the 9800X 3D was 43% faster than the 7600X, when paired with the 5090 and then 17% faster with the 5080. But this time, performance does equalize with the RX 9070 and therefore the 9060 XT. Now, if we enable the ultra quality preset, we still find that the 9800X 3D is much faster than the 7600X, at least at 1080p. This time, using the RTX 5090, the X3D part was 41% faster, and then 39% faster using the RTX 5080. It was also 33% faster with the RX 9070, though performance was much the same with the 9060 XT. Once again, we see that even at 1440p, this time using the ultra settings, that the 9800X 3D is 37% faster using the RTX 5090 and 36% faster with the RTX 5080. Then with the RX 9070, the margin is reduced to 13% before we end up heavily GPU limited with the 9060 XT. Finally, at 4K with the game's visuals maxed out, it's only the RTX 5090 that sees a difference in performance between these two CPUs, as it can still push well over 100 FPS, making the 9800X 3D 34% faster. But if you're using the RTX 5080 or something slower, with these quality settings you are going to end up GPU limited with either the 9800X 3D or 7600X. Finally, we have the 4-game average calculated using the geomean, which truth be told isn't particularly useful given that I only tested 4 games. Pretty lazy, I know, but if I skip over the average results, there's always a good amount of you who will rage in the comments, so I'm just trying to avoid that. Anyway, across the 4 games tested at 1080p using the medium settings, we saw on average a 37% increase for the 9800X 3D when paired with the RTX 5090. Then with the RTX 5080, that margin is reduced to 20% and then just 8% with the RX 9070, though surprisingly we still saw a 5% increase using the 9060 XT, despite much of that data being GPU limited. Then at 1440p, the 9800X 3D was 29% faster than the 7600X when both CPUs were paired with the RTX 5090. That margin was then slashed to 10% using the RTX 5080 and then down to 7% with the RX 9070. And then it's completely neutralized when using the 9060 XT. Finally, at 4K using the medium settings, we're looking at a 10% increase on average for the 9800X 3D when using the RTX 5090, 4% with the RTX 5080, and then nothing with the RX 9070, and then of course the 9060 XT. Now, when switching to the Ultra preset data at 1080p, the 9800X 3D was 26% faster with the RTX 5090, 10% faster when using the RTX 5080, 8% faster with the RX 9070, and then performance is the same using the 9060 XT. The 1440p data then is what you'd expect. It ends up a little more GPU limited when compared to what was seen at 1080p. Using the RTX 5090, the 9800X 3D was 11% faster, 9% faster with the 5080, 3% faster with the RX 9070, before we become entirely GPU limited with the 9060 XT. Then finally, at 4K, using the Ultra Quality preset, we saw for the most part very little difference in performance between the 7600X and 9800X 3D, on average just an 8% increase using the RTX 5090, and then nothing with the other 3 GPUs. So there you have it, the 7600X and 9800X 3D tested across a wide range of settings with 4 tiers of different graphics card performance. As you might expect, how these CPUs compare does depend heavily on the game and the quality settings used. Generally speaking though, if you're playing competitive shooters, in most instances you will end up being CPU limited, whereas AAA single player games they'll usually be GPU limited, but not always. We had 2 great examples of this, one being Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, where the ultra quality data at 1440p was entirely GPU limited, even with the RTX 5090. So in this sort of game, the priority really is on GPU performance, at least if you have a CPU equal to or greater than a Ryzen 5 7600, which admittedly is quite a powerful CPU. So for this sort of game, upgrading to the 9800X 3D is a waste of time and money, as you won't see any additional performance, though one caveat being that in more CPU demanding sections of the game, that could change. Now, a game that is very CPU demanding, and I know for a fact that I am testing a CPU demanding section of the game, is Space Marine 2. This time, at 1440p with the Ultra settings, the 9800X 3D was significantly faster than the 7600X, 37% faster for those of you using an RTX 5080 or better, which would only include the RTX 4090 and 5090. That margin is then reduced to 13% with the RX 9070, but still, that's a reasonable increase. Therefore, ideally you will want to know how much faster the 9800X 3D can be when compared to the 7600X. Not that I think you'd necessarily be tossing up between a CPU that currently costs $450 US and one that costs $190 US. The $450 option is typically for those after the best of the best, while the $190 option is more for those looking to get the most bang for their buck, and those two things rarely overlap. But if we look at my day one review data for the 9800X 3D, we see that across 14 games it was on average 38% faster than the 7600X, whereas this data showed it to be up to 43% faster, and then 37% faster on average when looking at the 1080p medium data using the RTX 5090. The point is, when CPU limited, the 9800X 3D can be around 40% faster than the 7600X, but depending on the games you play and how you play them, that margin may not be achieved right now, though expect to be more commonplace in the future as the kind of CPU load we see in Space Marine 2 becomes more the norm. At the end of the day though, it's important for you to understand what your CPU demands are, and you can work this out by looking at the games you play and how you play them. Also, as a side note, we did see some interesting examples of CPU overhead issues with the Blackwell GPUs, most notably of which was seen in Rainbow Six Siege. So if you'd like me to investigate this further, please do let me know in the comments section, and I'll look at adding the Ryzen 5 5600 to the mix, as that should give us a really good idea of how much this issue affects slower CPUs. For now though, I am done with this comparison, but like I said, there is much more to come. So if you enjoyed this format, you liked these benchmarks, then make sure you are subscribed because I will be releasing many more of them over the coming weeks and months. So pretty exciting stuff, I reckon. Also, if you'd like to become a Harbour Unboxed member, we have the join button or Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those. And I dropped some early graphs and things. I've actually put some graphs in there looking at the overhead issue for some of the testing I've already done that wasn't featured in this video. So you can see that on our Discord. We also do live streams, behind the scenes content and Q&A stuff. So yeah, like I said, check that out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.